Good morning from Edinburgh. Good evening, Jeju. I think currently I'm somewhere over Russia. My brain is still catching up with myself, but I will try and give you something of my experience and the joy of working with Korea over the last, well, actually it's 25 years I've been working with Angela Kwon, but I'll get back to that in a minute. So essentially, I just want to talk a bit about Edinburgh, the place it has in the world and what I do in it, and then how we work with people internationally. And first of all, let me just say that I entirely respect the comments made by the previous speaker about how arts and culture is so important to improving people's lives. I think it's worth stopping for a minute and just reflecting on where we've been. COVID was only a couple of years ago, and we went into this terrible isolation where I think it was awful for people individually to be locked away in spaces on their own. And the joy of the world that we work in, the cultural existence, is the fact that we can interact with each other and that you can enjoy live experience. And, you know, for all the ability while you're on your own to sit and watch Netflix or Amazon or any of these other things that you can find online, there is nothing like live experience in terms of engaging with people and actually give them a real understanding of life and the enjoyment of just understanding other people and an experience. So I celebrate the fact that we're back. I'm delighted to see that this 16th festival is being ambitious about developing and growing and looking beyond what it normally does to the international world. And so from that point of view, it's great to be here. We equally went through, I mean, there was a graph up there a second ago which showed a massive drop down in 2020 and then going back up again, and obviously hadn't got back up to where it was. We all fell off a cliff in the arts world for that year. It was a terrible time for the festival in Edinburgh. It stopped for a year. It came back again, a small amount the following year, and we got something of a kind of normal-ish festival back last year, but you know, normal is an unusual word at the moment. It does feel suddenly, though, now like we might be heading back towards normality. Certainly walking through an airport and seeing the number of people traveling these days, you have to think, God, I mean, it was not that long ago, I was getting on a plane. I'm based in Portugal, although I work in Edinburgh, and I was sitting on a plane with 6 people. And indeed, I think I got the last plane out of Gatwick when there were about 8 people running around this enormous airport. So to see so many people back again and actually engaging with life again is just joyous. And to see all of you here is pretty joyous. But anyway, enough of wobbling. Let me get on to talking about Edinburgh. So Edinburgh, it is the largest arts festival in the world. It didn't start out as that. It started in 1947 after the Second World War. It was basically modeled on the idea of Bayreuth and the Wagner Festival in Germany. And the British government came up with the idea of celebrating international relations through culture. And I think really with the view that understanding different cultures just gives you a great experience and, I don't know, gives you a better understanding of the importance of peace and collaboration. So they looked around for a city in Britain in which to do it, and Edinburgh was the one that got selected. It was founded around initially the International Festival, which was an event that was essentially classically driven through classical music, opera, and dance, and a bit of theatre, not a huge amount of theatre. And alongside it grew up this little event called the Edinburgh Fringe. And essentially the Fringe, I suppose, in a live context was the kind of version of the internet where anyone could do anything. And 13 companies turned up whilst this official event was going on and just said, well, we want to perform. So they got up and performed. Edinburgh's now grown into the biggest festival in the world because it's not just one festival, it's the International Festival, it's the Fringe. We have a tattoo which runs for a couple of weeks, which is enormous. It builds this huge, great setting underneath Edinburgh Castle, one of the most romantic views in the world, I think, when fireworks are going off and you've got people celebrating in uniform and dancing up and down next to the castle. We have a book festival, there's a jazz festival, there's a fine arts festival, and there's a television festival, and we also run a food festival. So it's kind of festival jamboree time in August in Edinburgh. Each year, I think something like 3 to 4 million people tend to come to see shows, and it's the biggest gathering of arts organizations from around the world. The Fringe is probably the bit that I'm most involved with because Assembly is part of the Fringe. I dare I say it, have been doing it for 43 years. It would be 44 if it wasn't for COVID. And I came there as a student. And the wonderful thing about it is the opportunity is there for anyone to take part. Essentially, if you want to put on a show, you can come and you can do it. Obviously, the difficult bit is being able to support yourself to get there. But if you can get on a stage, there is an audience to be found. And I think there's been great stories over the years of performers that turned up. Literally, I have one friend, Jhaf, who turned up one year with a one-man show, and I think the first night played to 2 people, and the second night he played to 3. And by the end of the festival, he was full, and he's run his career and reputation ever since on that. And the Fringe has grown as a result of that. I think when I began in 1979, there was something like 120 shows on the Fringe. Now I think each year something like 3,000 companies come every year. There was a slight dip as a result of COVID, but I think this year we're heading back to that again. So roughly that number will be taking part this year. I began Assembly in 1981. I followed the traditional path of people coming to the festival where you find a venue and you put on a show. I came in 1979 initially after I'd finished university. I was at university in South Africa. I'm from Zimbabwe originally. And I studied drama and came back to Britain and with a group of friends wanted to put on a play. So we found a venue in Edinburgh. We put the show on and it worked extraordinarily. We got a great audience and it got great reviews and was very successful. So the following year I thought, well, I'll try and do that again. And I was doing a master's degree and had no money. So I put together, I think it was 3 plays. I acted in one, directed another, and then presented another. And then I worked out how to do it was to build a venue and sublet it to other people, which is slightly ambitious, but I did it. The unfortunate thing was that you learn very fast in the industry what it involves. And I lost the keys to the venue. So I slept in the venue. I had to clean the toilets. I had to take the tickets from the audience. I had to direct one play and act in another. And I built the venue as well with various friends. So it was certainly a growth experience in the extreme. And I think that's the wonderful thing about Edinburgh. It is an experience beyond experiences. For any of you that have been, it is a marvelous, marvelous event. In 1981, I found this wonderful building in the center of the new town. Edinburgh has an old town and a new town. The new town, you'd think it was new, but actually it was in the 1700s that it was built. And the Assembly Rooms was built in 1787 as a social center for the new town of Edinburgh. And it went through a very checkered history over time. And at the time that I took it on in 1981, it kind of got very run down and it had a kind of faded grandeur about it. But I went in there, I saw all these great spaces, and I thought, why not turn this into a venue? So I built 5 theaters and put on 57 shows. And suddenly it was like being, I suppose, a bit like being in a cruise liner with shows going on all day. Because the one thing you have to remember about Edinburgh is it doesn't just, it's not one show a night. We start in the morning and we run through till the early hours of the following day. And you can literally watch hundreds of shows across a few days in Edinburgh. It's an incredible experience. Assembly takes its name from those days in the Assembly Rooms. I won't go into the history of the Assembly Rooms hugely, but it was a great building essentially, which was built for social events of the old days. I think today we present something like 200 shows each festival. We build 23 theaters. We're a very small team. I mean, we used to run it with 3 people. I'm now up to about 10 because we run various other projects as well. And we build 23 theaters across the city in many of its major venues. So we run still the Assembly Rooms. We also run the Assembly Hall, which is the home of the Church of Scotland. We build a lot of venues around the university, and we build a big garden space with some Spiegel tents in it. So all of that has to be built in the space of a few weeks prior to the festival. And then this jamboree of this wonderful gathering of shows starts. This year, I think we have something like 200 from around the world again. Over the time that I've been doing it, we've probably put on over 3,000 shows and played to about 8 million people. So it's certainly, it works because it's popular, because people enjoy it. the challenge of it is that you've got to make it work. It's lovely to hear the subsidy that venues get here and the support they get for all the theatres around the country. In Britain, we don't really get that, so the festival survives purely on the fact that we can excite the public to come. And the interesting thing, and I think probably the greatest experience, actually, the Korean season that I worked on with Angela over the years, has just been learning what works, because I love international work. I love seeing it come to Scotland. I've worked with countries from all over the world. I started in the 80s going to Russia before the wall came down and East Germany, and it was fascinating to work with people that were isolated, but then see the cultural side come across to Edinburgh. I'm a vegetarian, and I toured Russia, where I found it very difficult to find anything to eat. Very often I'd go into a hotel and all that you'd find would be a yogurt and a boiled egg. And then I went to this wonderful country, Georgia, and suddenly it was overflowing with food and wine and these most extraordinary, energetic performance people. And we've worked now with Georgia, I think, since the late 80s. I brought hundreds of shows from Georgia over the years. I've worked a lot with, there's someone from the Adelaide Festival here. I've worked a lot with Australia. In the late 80s, we started out something called OzNOST. I think 8 shows came over that year from Australia, and now a lot of my program, I'd say probably a third to half of my program is Australians that come over for the festival. And I think the joy of international work coming to the festival is the fact that you get to see something different, you get to learn and something new, and you get the experience and enjoyment of different cultures. The challenge of it, though, is actually getting it to work, because very often work in its own country stands up on its own and has its own following, but then it'll come out of that context into a foreign context, and it doesn't always work in the same way. So finding the right kind of things that will appeal to an international audience is a challenge. Inevitably, that means drama is difficult, because the language-based work is very hard to see up on a stage. There was a time, I think, when international work first really started coming to Britain in the 60s and 70s, where international work could come. I put on in the early 80s quite a lot of Russian shows in Russian, and people would come because of the novelty. But now, I think in the age of Netflix, people have not really got the capacity to sit and read things while they're watching a stage show or listen to it in a foreign language, which I think is sad. So it tends to mean that the work that comes from abroad is more focused on physical work, things like magic, things like dance, things that are more accessible and not language-based. But we've done a lot of that, and it's worked. There'd be some great successes that have come out of Korea over the years. Jhaf started in Edinburgh and toured the world from Edinburgh. Cooking happened in Edinburgh. We had a great show called Jump that did a lot of touring out of Edinburgh. And I think the great thing in Edinburgh is that it's a huge showcase. Producers come from all over the world, and you can bring a show there, and it can lead to an enormous future. We had from Canada a show called Traces from a company called Seven Fingers, which was one of my favorite productions. And they literally were a fairly young company, hardly known, and they brought this beautiful show which got huge recognition, and then got invited everywhere around the world to perform. And Seven Fingers is now one of the celebrated companies in Canada. They have 2 or 3 productions running, I think, in New York, and they tour the world with several different companies. So, the ability to be seen in Edinburgh and to achieve future work out of it is huge. Stomp started out, and I don't know if Stomp's been to Korea, I imagine it has. People performing with drums on dustbins, creating amazing sounds out of found instruments. They've been running since, I think, about 1990 now, and are still touring internationally. The Soweto Gospel Choir came out of Edinburgh. That was an idea a friend of mine in Australia came up with about creating a choir from South Africa. And he again thought Edinburgh was a great place to launch it. So he brought them there, and from that he's been touring it, I think, now for about 15 or 20 years. So to those of you that have ambition to come somewhere abroad and gain future work, I think coming to Edinburgh is probably one of the best things you can do. I tend to tell people not to come, because I think unless you really know why you want to come, you shouldn't do it. I presented to some Brazilian people last festival, and I said exactly that, and they haven't come this year. Maybe they'll come next year. But you've really got to try and work out what you want to achieve, where you want to go, and what your production really wants out of life, really, what it wants to achieve in terms of taking itself to the world. So good luck to all of you that are here presenting. I hope that your shows go extremely well and that you get lots of work out of this, and do come to Edinburgh. And actually, one of the last things I'd say is if you do want to come to Edinburgh, probably come and have a look before you bring a show, because getting to understand it, it is an extraordinary experience, and it has to be seen before you try and do it. Thank you very much.